Bonjour, hello, Kwei, 大家好. I am Scott Simon, Senior Fellow on Taiwan, Human Rights, and the Indo-Pacific at the MLI. It is my honor to moderate this webinar, A Seat at the Table, Why Canada Should Promote Taiwan's Inclusion at the UN and its Agencies. As anyone who watched the Tokyo Olympics may have noticed, Taiwan is marginalized. Taiwan has to call itself Chinese Taipei at the Olympics and is not permitted to use its flag or anthem. China protested when Japanese broadcaster NHK dared to call Taiwan, Taiwan, and when NBC showed a map of China that did not include Taiwan. What is this all about? The issue is the United Nations. The Republic of China, one of the allies in World War II and founding member of the UN, has been excluded from most global agencies since the 1970s. The root of the issue is that in China, the ROC was replaced in 1949 by the People's Republic of China. The ROC relocated to Taiwan and represented China at the United Nations until 1971. For decades, UN member states debated on how to provide representation to both China and Taiwan. Yet Beijing and Taipei insisted that they alone have the right to represent China. Neither side gave any consideration to the people of Taiwan. In 1971, the General Assembly passed Resolution 2758 to restore rights, and I quote, to the People's Republic of China and to recognize the representatives of its government as the only legitimate representatives of China to the United Nations, and to expel forthwith the representatives of Chiang Kai-shek from the place which they lawfully occupy at the United Nations and in all the organizations related to it, unquote. Please note very carefully, this resolution said nothing about the place of Taiwan in the UN. What happened is that the PRC replaced the ROC as the representative of China. Since 1971, China has evolved into a full democracy and is now requesting a seat at the table on its own merits. Canada's position was summarized in September 2019 to Globe and Mail by Global Affairs as, quote, Canada supports Taiwan's meaningful participation in international organizations where there's a practical imperative and where Taiwan's absence is detrimental to global interests, unquote. This is what we will talk about this morning. I will first introduce His Excellency Ambassador Winston Wen-Chen, who has served as ambassador to the Marshall Islands, which has full diplomatic relations with Taiwan, and now carries the duties of an ambassador in Ottawa with the official title of Representative Taipei Economic and Cultural Office. He will make some opening announcements now.
Thank you, Mixie, Dr. Simon, and the distinguished guest and the panelist. Bonjour, good morning, and bonsoir, good evening to our friends, colleagues, and everyone joining us today in Canada, Taiwan, and around the world. Thank you for taking part in this important and timely discussion on Taiwan's role in the international community. I would also like to thank the Macdonald-Laurier Institute for hosting this dialogue. At the risk of stating the obvious, global challenge require global solutions. This is why the United Nations has such a significant role to play when it comes to tackling the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and the international sustainable development. And yet, for half a century, Taiwan has been sidelined, excluded not only from the UN General Assembly, but also from the entire UN system, putting solution to this global challenge further out of reach. Owing to the pressure from the People's Republic of China, which has never governed Taiwan, we remain excluded. Taiwanese passport holders are denied access to UN premises for tours or meetings, and then Taiwanese journalists are unable to obtain accreditation to cover UN events. Let us be clear. There is no UN resolution that supports Beijing's claim of sovereignty over Taiwan. Taiwan is governed by a representative and a democratically elected government with its own sovereign decision-making authority, coming from the Taiwanese people. Please consider for a moment the injustice of excluding 23.5 million Taiwanese people from being represented at the United Nations and its specialized agency and organizations. Taiwan is unable to contribute to or benefit from global information sharing during the current pandemic, despite our success at managing COVID-19. It also means one of the 20 largest economies in the world is arbitrarily sidelined for its contributions to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. Let alone the WHO, ICAO, UNFCCC, Interpol, the list goes on. This is unjustifiable and then contrary to the stated values and the principles of the UN. Despite this exclusion, Taiwan remains an active partner. We are delighted to contribute meaningfully to the global supply of PPEs throughout the pandemic, including the donation to Canada, as well as sharing the Taiwan model of pandemic management with our friends and allies. Additionally, we are proud to say that we have reduced poverty to historic lows, achieved universal health coverage, and are actively working to minimize our environmental impacts. It is important to note that Taiwan is a major contributor to these same efforts in dozens of partner countries across the globe. This is just us working on the sidelines. Imagine how much more we can accomplish if we are part of the UN system. Taiwan can help, and Taiwan is helping. We want to play our part in making the world a better place. Therefore, we call on Canada and other like-minded countries to continue supporting Taiwan's meaningful participation in multilateral organizations. Only by working together can we ensure a fair, functional, and rule-based international order rooted in our shared interests and values. Once again, I would like to thank MLI and all the participants. With that, I will pass the floor back to the moderator. Professor Simon, over to you.
No, thank you very much, Your Excellency, for your comments this morning. I think they're a good way of setting the stage. I'd like to introduce our three speakers right now. We have Russell Shao, who is Executive Director of the Global Taiwan Institute in Washington, D.C., Tiffany Ma, Senior Director at Bauer Asia Group, a strategic advisory group for businesses in Asia, and J. Michael Cole, Senior Fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. So each speaker will be invited now to briefly introduce themselves and make some opening comments. So we begin with Russell.
Well, thank you very much, Simon and MLI, for the invitation to participate in this very timely panel, and for Ambassador Chen for those very excellent scene-setting remarks. Allow me to expand a bit on Ambassador Chen's comment, what I thought was really spot on in terms of why supporting Taiwan's international space is important for Canada, the United States, and the international community as a whole. And I'd like to make three quick points about this. And that is, there is a moral dimension to supporting Taiwan's international space. There is a governance dimension to supporting Taiwan's international space. And finally, and this is perhaps underappreciated in our broader discourse about international space, is there's a security dimension as well. And so what do I mean by a moral dimension to supporting Taiwan's international space? I think especially in the context of this growing contest between democracies and autocracies, more specifically the authoritarian revisionist powers, the issue of Taiwan's international space and participation is all the more material to the international community, in the sense that Taiwan stands literally on the front line of China. And as what we witnessed with what happened to Hong Kong over the last several years and the obliteration of the one country, two systems model, who could reasonably say that Taiwan and the people of Taiwan should be ruled or represented by the People's Republic of China, even despite the fact, as the ambassador noted, that Taiwan has never been a part of the People's Republic of China. Oftentimes, the context of legitimacy and diplomacy it misses the sort of the moral standpoint that I think this issue now is becoming more increasingly a part of. And also I would add that this doesn't require taking a position on the issue of sovereignty. It is important that the support of legitimacy and the democratic model that Taiwan presents is an issue on its own merit as well. The second governance dimension is that there's serious implications of international institutions that are increasingly under the control of Beijing. And these implications extend beyond just a matter of Taiwan's exclusion. The PRC currently controls 3 of the 15 UN specialized agencies, the Food and Agricultural Organizations, the International Telecommunications Union, and the UN Industrial Development Organization. I'll invite all your viewers to go on the website, of ITU and really see what these institutions play a role in. They set standards, they set rules, norms, and practices that have extraterritorial effects. And I think this is very important, especially in this digital age that we live in terms of the role of the ITU. A practical example in terms of how control of international institutions can play a real effect in terms of our international community is the role of institutions like Interpol and being able to issue notices that could really affect the lives of political dissidents around the world. And certainly the reliance and the influence of Beijing in these international institutions can have a material effect in terms of the rules that these institutions abide by, and also the practical effects of their role in the function that they play. The third and final dimension is the security dimension, and this one is often ignored in the context of our debate about international space. And that is that governments and the public at large need to appreciate that seemingly symbolic moves like international participation or international space does have substantive value in terms of broadening and deepening Taiwan's international participation, which have security benefits. A Taiwan that is more strongly wedded to the international community will likely produce a more intense international response to a potential use of military force by China to resolve the cross-strait issue, which as we've seen in the debate here in the United States as well as internationally, and just observing the pattern of behavior by Beijing makes this likelihood all the more possible. This will make it harder for Beijing to present, and it will present a greater risk of rallying other states to become more involved in the conflict, not necessarily militarily, but politically, economically as well. So, this is an important dimension that I think we need to cover more of. I know that that we're restricted on time, so I'll leave it there and look forward to the comments of my other co-panelists. Good.
Thank you very much, Russell. We'll move on to Tiffany.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott. And I wanted to thank the Macdonald-Laurier Institute for hosting this very timely discussion today. My name is Tiffany Ma. I am a Senior Director at Bao Group Asia. We are a DC-based strategic advisory and government relations consulting firm with offices in over 25 markets across the Indo-Pacific. I'm also a non-resident fellow at the National Bureau of Asian Research, a US-based Asia policy think tank. So I want to begin today by making 2 observations on Taiwan's participation in international organizations. First is that the question of Taiwan at the United Nations has really evolved from who has the rightful claim to the China seat at the UN to now China, the PRC, using the United Nations as a platform for denying Taiwan's international legitimacy. China is concerned that Taiwan would leverage UN participation into a path for formal statehood. So now the PRC is using the UN and its related entities as a way to sort of dictate cross-strait relations. So for example, during the détente of the Ma Ying-jeou era, we saw that Taiwan was sort of rewarded with the carrots of participation, observership at the WHA, And now that Beijing is very much pressuring the Taiwan government, sort of criticizing the DPP for not recognizing the 1992 consensus, and thus, in their view, damaging the political foundations for Taiwan's WHA observership. The second observation I want to make is that China's politicization of international forums goes way beyond the United Nations and really extends to the private sector and also academia. I like to illustrate that no opportunity is too small or trivial for China. My favorite example is that the Chinese consulate in Australia pressured a local Australian council to paint over a children's art project that featured a flag of Taiwan. So we see that Beijing is really exporting the domestic practice of eradicating Taiwan's narrative and replacing it with Beijing's One China principle. And Beijing is doing this in very much an incremental way by co-opting organizations and platforms to really change the facts on the ground with respect to Taiwan's international status. We've seen over recent years that China's pressures against Taiwan has continued and even increased, despite growing international attention and opposition. However, Beijing seems to deem that it's worth risking international criticism to coerce and compel Taiwan towards Beijing's vision of unification under the banner of Xi Jinping's China dream. So for Canada, the United States, and like-minded countries, I think this certainly calls for a more unified and coordinated approach to address the PRC's ambitions. So I'll leave it there with those 2 points, and I look forward to deeper discussions during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much, Tiffany. We now move on to J. Michael Cole.
Well, thank you, Scott. Thank you, MLI, for inviting me. Greetings from Taiwan. It's an honor to be here. My name is J. Michael Cole. I'm with Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I'm also with the Global Taiwan Institute with Russell Xiao in Washington, D.C. And recently I've joined the Prospect Foundation as well here in Taipei. So a few brief observations. I would say that it's important as we strive to help Taiwan get a seat at the UN table, it's important to keep in mind that states are not purely altruistic. Taiwan's role at the UN is therefore a matter of national interest to countries around the world. And that is why, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, that support for Taiwan among leading democracies has been increasing. With the realization that keeping Taiwan out in the cold is not only ludicrous, it's also self-defeating, and it's even dangerous for international security. And yet, despite the growing support that we have seen for Taiwan in recent years, every year Taiwan and its allies have struck out. They have been defeated by Beijing's obstructionism. We must therefore ask ourselves if more of the same strategy that we've been using in recent years will eventually lead to different results or different outcomes for Taiwan. I would say that the key would be to counter China's influence at the UN General Assembly, especially among countries that depend on infrastructure investment, which Beijing has successfully provided in return for heavy political influence. We need a new strategy in that area. Otherwise, I fear that we're going to keep repeating the same mistakes and certainly keep obtaining the same outcomes when it comes to ensuring Taiwan's participation, meaningful participation at specialized agencies or at the UN itself. So what we've seen over the years is ad hoc measures that may be a temporary strategy for Taiwan, again, such as what we've seen during the COVID pandemic, or when Taiwan is hosting major international sports events, such as the recent games in Taipei a couple of years ago, where Taiwan was unable to access important information from Interpol concerning the potential for terrorist attacks against delegates here in Taipei. And other countries were able to provide the kind of intelligence that Taiwan needed. But I would say that ad hoc measures are insufficient and can cause delays that could result in catastrophic outcomes. If ad hoc measures are to remain the strategy for the foreseeable future, then we need something that is perhaps more institutionalized, perhaps something like a UN-Taiwan working groups where states can provide information to Taiwan and relay information from Taiwan back to the UN system. anyway, so these are a few things that I think we should keep in mind as we jump into the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you, everybody. I think that so far, the ambassador and all three speakers have done a really good job of summarizing the situation of Taiwan and its relationship with the UN and related agencies. You know, Canada's been a big player in this from the very beginning, from the 1952 treaty that actually took Taiwan away from Japan. And then at the United Nations, Canada has been very important in getting China at the seat at the United Nations. And in those debates prior to that at the UN, talking about possible General Assembly membership for Taiwan. Trudeau, the father, of course, was very important in creating the name Chinese Taipei at the Olympics in Montreal. And so there's a long history or path dependence about Canadian involvement. So let's kind of think now a little bit more about Canadian policy towards Taiwan's place in the international system. And what we'll do is I've got a number of questions that have come in. And so let's go through with them, and I'll just say the answer, and whoever say the question, and whoever would like to answer is free to do so. So one of the questions I have is that what are the holdups? What are the obstacles for the Canadian government to support greater participation of Taiwan at the UN?
Well, okay. Well, Michael, please go ahead. I'll take go for it. Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's have the Canadian national try to respond first. Well, I would say it's primarily a lack of vision on the part of Canadian government, and that we can speculate about all kinds of reasons, but one of them certainly that has been mentioned frequently, particularly with the Liberal government, is the grip, if you will, that big business conglomerates have on Canada's foreign policy, and certainly on policy towards China and Taiwan. Mm-hmm. So there is deep resistance within institutions, but also even in academia and the few think tanks in Canada that do look at the Indo-Pacific, if they look at all at Taiwan. It's this continuing fear of angering or alienating Beijing by further engaging Taiwan, let alone pushing the envelope on things like Taiwan's participation at the UN. I think we really need a shift in Ottawa to break that blockage and start seeing a Canadian government that will, engage in calculated risks, but we're now starting to see a good number of countries, including democracies that are much less powerful, if you will, than Canada as a middle power, that are willing to defy Beijing on not only opening offices, Taiwanese offices in their country, using the name Taiwan, but extremely vocal in calling for Taiwan's participation, meaningful participation at the UN institutions. If small countries like Czech Republic and Lithuania can do it, it's very difficult to imagine why a major economy like Canada, a member of G7, could not also reflect its own values and do more in that regard. And again, it's also in Canada's self-interest to ensure that Taiwan has a seat at the table. It's that fear that gets in the way. So over to you.
Yeah, Canada just had an election. So what possibilities are there for some change going ahead, or some adjustments to Canada's approach in the new government?
Scott, if I may, not the question of the change in government, but to your earlier question, I do want to echo what Michael had said, and I think he made a very good point. And even though he didn't use a specific word, I think leverage is the issue here. Right. I think the perceived lack of leverage on the part of governments, not just in Canada. This is not unique to Canada. A lot of other governments too. Especially economic leverage, given the disparity of China's economic relationship with most countries being the most traded nation with the other countries. But I think that there was a lack of creativity here in terms of many of the governments, in terms of dealing with China, in terms of these lack of economic leverage, and herein is that there has been a lack of solidarity particularly among, I think democracies that are now, I think increasingly awakened to the fact that China's economic lever does come at, significant political cost. And while I think, Taiwan and other countries along its periphery have experienced sort of the political cost of China's economic coercive measures, other countries now, Australia and certainly other countries are experiencing that cost and are now working together more closely to ensure that that China is not able to manipulate these relationships in a manner that would serve its political goals. So that would be the point that is that I would just observe in a general terms and not specifically on Canada itself.
Good.
Scott, on your question of, Canada's approach, I mean, I kind of want to go back to something that Michael said about what is in Canada's interest and, how we should really consider how China's influence over international organizations is affecting Canadian interests. I mean, for decades, Western countries like Canada had hoped that by bringing China into these organizations, that it would change Beijing by sort of socializing these norms and patterns of responsible global governance. And, this is sort of the very alluring premise of the responsible stakeholder. Yet under Xi Jinping, we've seen that they've been co-opting international organizations to protect the CCP and to defend China's interests, especially with regards to territorial sovereignty and with regards to its interests in Taiwan, to protect Chinese companies like Huawei, to shield China from scrutiny over human rights issues like with the Uyghurs. So I think the Canadian government can kind of play a pretty significant role in using its seat at the UN and its voice to target the ways that China specifically tries to undermine Taiwan at the United Nations. So China is really limiting Taiwan in sort of three ways. First, China commonly refers to the UN Resolution 2758, often in breath, as their one China principle. And this sort of creates a narrative that the UN has sort of adjudicated Taiwan's legitimacy when countries like Canada has a one China policy that is distinct from the one China principle. And China can kind of help clarify some of that narrative. And then second, China has really tried to dictate how Taiwan's referred to. I think someone mentioned earlier, there was a leaked WHO memo that where the WHO designated Taiwan as the Taiwan province of China. And this was also imposed by China on NGOs through the ECOSOC NGO committee. So, this is a role where for Canada to sort of address the nomenclature and push back on some of these very ridiculous designations for Taiwan. And then, I think the last thing I would say is, procedure-wise, I think China has really tried to control and limit how Taiwan engages with the UN. So, for example, Taiwan's participation in the WHA has to be approved by the Chinese mission in Geneva and approved by the Ministry of Health. So if there's a way for Canada to sort of leverage its positions to sort of push back in terms of policy and process at these international organizations, I think that would also help to increase Taiwan's participation and, again, doing something that is in Canada's interests.
Good, thank you. Michael?
Right. Well, briefly to answer your second question, in the wake of the non-event that was the recent elections in Ottawa, I mean, we're not going to see much change because we're still end up with a minority liberal red-led government. I think, I mean, one extra variable that could eventually lead Canada to be a bit more proactive on the Taiwan front is that for many years, advocating for Taiwan was very much seen as a US-led initiative. And as you know, every Canadian also has within him and herself a little bit of an anti-American streak that we oftentimes want to, differentiate ourselves and define ourselves as, that which we are not, which is Americans. We're not like the big bad imperialists that supposedly inhabit the White House and all that. But the more you see other countries, influential countries like Japan, for example, but certainly France, Australia, and other countries, and smaller ones, as I said, Czech Republic and Lithuania being two recent examples, the more you see other countries, other democracies take the lead in advocating for Taiwan in their own self-interest, it should become easier as well for Canada to realize, okay, well, we're not alone. We're not bandwagoning with the Americans. This is increasingly a global initiative, or at least an initiative that is now led by a growing coalition of democracies. So I think we're going to see that kind of pressure as well, gradually start to influence, or at least hopefully influence policy in Ottawa towards China, but equally towards Taiwan.
Okay, let's move on. No, Russell?
Yeah, if I may, I just want to build on what Michael had said, and I think given that this is his point about the relationship between the United States and Canada, how Canadians perceive their relationship with the United States, is an interesting one, and I think and I do think it's important that we can't separate this with the U.S.-Canada dimension to this broader discussion about international community support for Taiwan's international space. And therein, I think it's important to sort of also point out that perhaps providing a perspective here in Washington that we shouldn't take our closest geographic ally for granted here, right? And I think it's important that, given the emphasis of the Biden administrations on working closer with allies and partners, I think the same point could be applied to Canada here. And I think U.S. leadership is important. And even though there are intrinsic value for why Canada should support Taiwan, there is the international relations component to it and the U.S.-Canada relationship component to it that we also need to take into account to make sure that what we talk about here does have, sort of practical and applicable to how we can really help advance, Canada's role in international situation over Taiwan. And I would quote here, because I do think it's important, instructive of how the Biden administration approaches the Taiwan policy as a point on which perhaps there could be further discussions on how Canada on its own could, and in relations with the United States, work to help enhance Taiwan's international space. And here I quote Kirk Campbell, who is the Indo-Pacific coordinator in the Biden's National Security Council, where he states, "Our goal now is to enhance deterrence, right? When we do that through a number of integrated efforts," and I emphasize integrated, clear statements of purpose, private warnings, assurances, encouragement of Taiwan to take the appropriate defense reform acts, making sure that our own capability is strong and vibrant, and to bring other countries into the effort, end quote. And there, I think, is that, and it really emphasizes here the importance of the international component, and hopefully, the Biden administration, working with its allies and a close Five Eyes geographic ally like Canada, can really start playing a more active role in and around Taiwan Strait. Thanks.
Good. I think we can pick up from there, because you say bringing in international allies, other countries, so that we can maybe take a look at some of the events of this week. One of them is that China and Taiwan have both requested to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. Canada, this morning in the Globe and Mail, said that they will not publicly support either Taiwan or China joining the Cptpp, as that should be a matter of consensus among members. So maybe we could speak to, first of all, to Taiwan's admission to the Cptpp. It's a trade issue, so maybe Tiffany, you can start with that one.
Sure, happy to take first pass at it. Well, I think first, Taiwan's interest in joining the Cptpp goes back even when it was just the TPP. And, Taiwan has obviously been wary of the anticipated Chinese oppositions to its application, just because if China does join first, I think that could possibly jeopardize Taiwan's application, since the Cptpp accession has a very high bar, which is that it requires the unanimous consent of all active members. So on that topic, I think Canada can play a role in supporting Taiwan's application at the CPTPP through sort of this collective action, which we just discussed, which is collaboration and coordination with other like-minded countries. So for example, I think it's important that when we're talking about Taiwan's applications to international bodies or multilateral bodies, is to internationalize it. And that is, again, not leaving this as a matter of cross-strait relations for China to dictate or waiting for China to dangle this as a sort of carrot to Taiwan, but really taking stakes in the process and procedures regarding Taiwan's and China's accession. I know Canada does not want to publicly support either application, but I think there is definitely room for working behind the scenes with Japan, which has already expressed support for Taiwan joining the CPTPP, and other partners like Australia to find a path for both, for Taiwan to join and for both China and Taiwan to sort of work with the CPTPP going forward. I think this is very politically tenable. I did see a 2020 poll by APF Canada, which said I think almost 70% of Canadians supported Taiwan joining the CPTPP. And lastly, I will say, sort of in addition to working on Taiwan's CPTPP and China's CPTPP bid, I think there's room for Canada to work with Taiwan bilaterally on trade outside of this multilateral framework, specifically towards finalizing a bilateral investment agreement. And this sort of helps build on Taiwan's existing trade agreement with two other CPTPP countries, specifically New Zealand and Singapore.
Good. Michael or Russell, would you like to weigh in on this?
Okay, very briefly, there's not much I can add to what Tiffany just said, but I think the key word here is institutionalized, and there's a role for Canada in that, if only to make sure that no single member state within CPTPP, I always get the acronym wrong, but you know what I'm talking about, doesn't feel that it's alone facing pressure from Beijing on Taiwan's bid. As is rumored to be the case with Peru right now. There's talk in Taiwan that Beijing is putting pressure on Peru to basically say no to Taiwan joining that grouping. So the more you have member states that are vocal in their support for Taiwan's joining, the less likely it is that member states will feel that they're alone facing that type of pressure from China. If countries like Canada, on the other hand, remain silent, then that leaves these countries guessing and possibly fearing that they're isolated and they cannot afford to not give in to pressure from Beijing.
Yeah,
I would just briefly add one additional point, and perhaps given that the United States is no longer a member of the TPP, people may discount the U.S. role in being able to help facilitate Taiwan's participation. And there, I think there is a role for Washington to play, despite not being a member of TPP. Of course, it would be better if the United States was a member of the CPTPP now, in order to be able to more lobby the other governments to be able to include Taiwan. But nonetheless, I think the United States can and should work bilaterally or through other multilateral forums to be able to help encourage governments who are members of CPTPP to allow for Taiwan's accession. And I think that and I believe that people do recognize the importance of Taiwan's inclusion in multilateral institutions, especially these economic groupings that could really marginalize Taiwan if it was not allowed to be a member of, while China is, basically given free rein through either eventual accession into CPTPP, that's a big if, but through other economic groupings that it has initiated, like the RCEP, or the one that it dominates, like RCEP, that could really have a significant effect on regional institutions. Not only that it would affect Taiwan by marginally Taiwan economically, but for standards and rules and norms in the Indo-Pacific region as well. So I think there is a role for the U.S. to play here.
Yeah. Beyond the U.S., because Russell, you brought up the issue of security. I think that Japan is one of the leaders on this. They were one of the first. Well, Japan really was the one that brought the CPTPP into existence. And in the white paper, they've shown that they've stated that the Taiwan Strait situation is a very serious security concern. The defense minister has been very supportive of Taiwan, and I think that it's with the Suga, the prime minister, has been very supportive, and of course, as the LDP is looking for the new chair, then they're also being very supportive of Taiwan. So there's that security issue that Japan is really drawing our attention to. So I think I'll ask two questions here. One of them concerns Japan because it's the Quad, Japan, Australia, India, and the US. And so is there a role for Taiwan in the Quad? That would be a first question. And then this week, of course, there was that deal with Australia about the nuclear submarine, the Australia, United Kingdom, United States Pact, which excludes Japan for the moment. But what role would that have in dealing with security issues about Taiwan?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Scott. I think it's incredibly important, and I think it goes back to that earlier point I was making in referencing Kurt Campbell's remarks on how this administration views deterrence and the importance of really bringing on other countries into the effort in sort of this strategic deterrence and in building strength in numbers of allies and partners. I think it's important to note that the Quad is paying attention to the Taiwan Strait. I think the senior ministers, the senior officials meeting that took place back in Australia, back in August, mentioned the Taiwan Strait specifically, and with relations to Japan, there's been the Leaders Summit that also highlighted peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, and more broadly, and beyond, in the G7 summit. And more recently in the Australia-US ministerial consultations, where there was significant attention paid to peace and stability. So I think we're already seeing this sort of this network. They're building out the network of like-minded countries in bringing their focus more on the Taiwan Strait issues. And there, I think in terms of any kind of role for Taiwan, I think that certainly from Taipei's perspective, would like to have more participation in some form in Quad-related activities. I think that that the sort of any formal role on the part of Taiwan would be be prescribed in part by sort of limitations on the part of the government's ability to interact officially with counterparts in Taiwan. But I mean, that certainly doesn't preclude any type of sort of efforts on the part of the governments to work with Taiwan in other in forums associated with the Quad. I think that is what I would add. I think in terms of Tokyo, I think Tokyo has taken a lead in dealing with the issue of China's increasing aggressive behavior towards Taiwan, and it's looking at this, and also its security interests with regards to the Ryukyu Island chains and the Senkakus or Diaoyutai, and it's looking at enhancing security cooperation with Taipei, and there was the recent dialogue between the ruling party of Taiwan, the Democratic Progressive Party, with the Liberal Democratic Party as well. And I think there are indications that the two sides are looking to be able to enhance their cooperation to deal with really the aggressive posturing by the People's Liberation Army. I know that Michael can certainly speak more to his observations on really what the extent and scope of those activities are.
Yeah, Michael.
All right, that was my cue. Well, thanks, Russell. I mean, a few things to add. I completely agree with Russell that a full membership by Taiwan within the Quad is, for the foreseeable future, highly unlikely, again, because of limitations resulting from Taiwan's status and fears in some governments that if they have mill-to-mill relationship with Taiwan, for example, that could cause them problems with Beijing. That being said, that does not preclude Taiwan of offering assistance in different capacities Intelligence sharing, surveillance, for example, are areas where Taiwan can do more. Search and rescue involving Coast Guard are also areas that are not highly controversial and that very likely Taiwan would get away with in working with partners. So there's a gradualistic approach to perhaps integrating Taiwan into that construct, but in a way that does not make it appear that this is pure containment aimed at China, which would then compel it to lash out against weaker members of the Quad or the Quad as a whole. With Japan in particular, I mean, there's a huge debate right now as to the extent to which Japan would be willing to become involved in a Taiwan Strait contingency if China were to attack Taiwan. But certainly the government has become much more vocal in the past year or so in positioning Taiwan as a component of its own national security in the defense white paper, and certainly defense minister as well, and Japanese leadership in general has said a lot more about Taiwan. I sense that this is possibly part of an endeavor on the part of Japanese governments to also educate the Japanese public about the necessity of ensuring the continued sovereignty of Taiwan as a component of national security for Japan. If you spend time in Tokyo, interact with government officials and talk with different people and think tanks, for them it's obvious that Taiwan has a role to play, that Taiwan is important to Japan's national security. But if you ask ordinary Japanese on the street what they think about Taiwan, they think of it as a former colony of Japan, of which we are proud, as a wonderful tourist destination, as a trade partner, but it's not part of their consciousness that Taiwan is also intrinsically linked to Japan's national security. So if Japanese government truly intends at some point to do more when it comes to the Taiwan Strait, it will need to have some support from the Japanese public. So I think there's a conversation that's starting to happen in Japan. Think tanks are leading the charge as well, but the government is being more proactive, and that could eventually translate in greater willingness on the part of the Japanese public for their government to do more with Taiwan. So that remains to be seen, but I think there's interesting developments in that regard as well.
Scott, if I may just quickly add to what Michael had said about public opinion in Japan, I do think it's important to point out a pretty interesting public opinion poll that was done by Nikkei back in April on Japanese public opinion, in which, I think over 70% indicated that it supported a Japanese role in maintaining peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. This was following the President Biden, Prime Minister Suga summit, where they unprecedentedly post-1969 included, the inclusion of Taiwan Strait in the leaders' joint statement. So I think the public opinion is moving, in that direction. We're having that debate on that issue. And I would add also as well that, there's been, I think it's a pretty significant shift in also in American public opinion on matters related to Taiwan. And I point to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs poll that was recently released, where 52% the American public would favor use of military force to defend Taiwan in the case of a Chinese invasion. And that's significant, in the sense that in 1982, when this poll was first conducted, only 18%, that supported the use of military force. And this is, I think, coupled with other indicators in American public opinion that has, I think, moved in favor of greater support, for Taiwan. And I would be interested to, to see where Canadian public opinion is on this question as well.
Scott, maybe just jumping in with a few observations on the Quad and the Australia, UK, US initiative. It's interesting. I mean, these are sort of two groupings that are very much driven by China's concerns about China's growing assertiveness in the region. The joint statements don't explicitly state China, but we do see that the topics that they talk about are very much oriented towards concerns related to China's growing influence. At the Quad, we've seen them do naval exercises. Last year, there's been talks about collaborating on issues like climate change, COVID-19 vaccines, supply chain resiliency. So all these are topics that are priority issues in Taiwan, and topics where Taiwan hoped to make progress in contributions to the international system. So Japan has been kind of toying discussions with this idea of a Quad Plus format. So perhaps that's a way for informal engagement with Taiwan going forward. And going to the Australia, US, UK initiative, I mean, both that and the Quad, I mean, Taiwan is probably a very clear beneficiary of these arrangements. For the new pact, I think Taiwan has very much responded with that. It welcomes it, and it sees very much it has common interests with these three countries: Australia, UK, and the US, in China. And strategically, I mean, Taiwan is a beneficiary of Australia fielding much more stealthy, much more longer range submarines in the Pacific Ocean. But I think more importantly, all these trends really signal these countries' growing commitment, at least willingness to state their commitment to Taiwan. So right after the Australia, US, UK deal, Australia and United States held a bilateral with the defense and foreign ministers. And the joint statement both committed to strengthen ties to Taiwan and also help Taiwan increase its meaningful participation in international organizations. So, while Taiwan isn't officially a part of these groupings, the fact that Taiwan has a lot of common interests with them, and that these countries are becoming more forward-leaning in their support for Taiwan, I mean, I think these are all very positive signals.
So this week, there's also been an MLI study talking about submarines and Canada's need to upgrade its submarines. Maybe Canada could consider some nuclear submarines. But, as we're talking in the MLI and other think tanks about Canada in the Quad, and I think we're going to be talking about Canada in this AUKUS pact, but there's the question that Russell and Michael brought up, and that's public opinion. For Japanese people, I think that when Japanese people, and people often overlook the fact that Taiwan is closer to Japan than it is to China, but Japanese tourists can actually travel in their own country and go down to Yonaguni, and then they can see Taiwan from there. But for Canadians, Taiwan might seem like it's very, very far away. So what can be done to educate Canadians and get Canadians involved? What is the Canadian stake in all of this for the ordinary person?
Well, I mean, one point that I always raise when I am asked that question is simply to ask Canadian counterparts if they know how many Canadian nationals actually live in Taiwan. Usually the response is a blank stare or a couple of thousand. So when you actually tell them, and I've quizzed people at Department of National Defense, and they didn't know the answer to that question. When I told them that there's 60,000 Canadian nationals living in Taiwan who would need to be evacuated if it came to a contingency in the Taiwan Strait, then they recoil in horror, and you can see that the wheels start turning, and they're saying, "Oh God, we went through this in Lebanon in 2006. It's going to be the same situation in Taiwan Strait." So certainly there is that element that makes Canadians think about that kind of scenario. No doubt, the blow to the global economy that would result from conflict in the Taiwan Strait could not have an impact, and a detrimental one at that, on the Canadian economy. The very large Taiwanese, Hong Kong, Tibetan, Uyghur diaspora, there's hundreds of thousands living in Canada as well. Canada is one of those countries where there always is a fear that conflict overseas could eventually lead to conflict at home as well. And in my years when I worked Canadian Security Intelligence Service, that's something that constantly was brought to the table, and back then it was instability in Haiti, for example. Then it compelled us to think about potential clashes in the streets of Montreal, where you have a heavy representation of Haitians who are from different factions within Haiti. So that's another element as well: domestic security in Canada, or insecurity stemming from conflict overseas, and that certainly would apply to the Taiwan Strait as well. So again, that refers back to my initial remarks: is we need to find ways to appeal to the national interest of countries. They will never act purely in altruistic fashion when it comes to countries that, as you just said, geographically are quite distant from Canada. So to them, it's not a priority. But we need to find ways to make that a reality and to basically combat that geographical distance and narrow that gap and make people realize why they should care. And one last point, you cannot expect that a ruthless regime like the CCP in Beijing would content itself with Taiwan. If it prevailed upon Taiwan, with the international community not reacting in some fashion, then it would very likely conclude that it can move to its next target and would also get away with it. I don't want necessarily to draw analogies with World War II, but we certainly need to pay attention to the nature of the regime in Beijing, and it is a ruthless one. So we don't want to lead it to conclude that it can get away with that kind of aggression. Taiwan is a line in the sand, it's a line at sea, it's a frontline state, and it needs to be defended, and Canada has a role to play in that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Tiffany?
Yeah, so the non-Canadian perspective on why ordinary Canadians should care about this. I mean, I think picking up on what Michael said, I mean, the China issue does touch on every facet of Canadian business and civil society now. You know, China's pressures on airlines has led Air Canada to list Taipei as the destination of Taiwan, China. So, I mean, that has to be extremely confusing for ordinary Canadians that are trying to travel, and that this is not to mention that the International Civil and Aviation Organization is actually headquartered in Canada as well. Canadian organizations like the Halifax Forum, you know, they can't give a prize to the Taiwanese president without a lot of political pushback and controversy from China, because, you know, China sees this as an act of validating Taiwan. From a human rights perspective, you know, their fellow Canadians are held in arbitrary and indefinite detention in China, and that's something that Beijing has very much used to their leverage in putting pressure on Ottawa as well. And then, you know, geographically, I know there's distance between Canada and China, but like, think about China's increasing interest in the Arctic, which borders Canada. I mean, despite the fact that Beijing is 3,500 miles away from the North Pole, it's claiming itself to be a near Arctic state, and it has sent its icebreakers up to the waters off of Canada. So in terms of why Canadian citizens should care, I mean, I think this is something that cross-cuts a lot of different facets of society. And, you know, if they can sort of maintain the pressures on elected officials and help sort of educate the broader discourse about China's actions and as well as Taiwan's importance, this helps create greater accountability, I think, among elected officials to sort of act in Canada's longer-term interest.
Good. So we have only about 3 minutes left. So I think that we can go through and everybody can make a concluding statement, and then we will have to end. So, Michael?
You put me on the spot. Okay. What to add? Yeah, again, I think it's the trends are. I'm optimistic about the trends again, because, you know, for those of us who have been looking at Taiwan for several years, and I've been here for 16, more than the first half of my career here was highly frustrating, because you would go to any capital, perhaps with the exception of Washington, D.C., and you would get utter disinterest in anything pertaining to Taiwan, because it was not relevant to them at all. I think China has been very, very helpful in convincing other countries that not only do they need to revisit or rethink their relationship with China, but in doing so, it also has led them to rethink the value of democracies in the Indo-Pacific and their own relationship with Taiwan. So I think today was about United Nations, but I think that can be extended to other areas as well. It looks promising for Taiwan. We need to keep at it. And I think that unless there's a drastic change in behavior in Beijing, which I don't see happening anytime soon, certainly not under Xi Jinping, we're going to see more and more openings for Taiwan in different fora. We might need to be constructive, but I think opportunities to tighten Taiwan's relationship with international community will continue to grow.
Okay, Tiffany?
Thanks. Maybe three broad things to summarize, I think, what Canada can focus on. I think one is obviously internationalize the issue. I think we talk about it, you know, especially try to institutionalize some process for Taiwan's participation, especially at places like WHO, ICAO, Interpol, UNFCCC, and to sort of really reduce that space for China to squeeze Taiwan. Second, I think Canada to focus working bilaterally with Taiwan or in multilateral groupings that don't involve China. So that's, you know, maybe participating in the US-Taiwan Global Cooperation Training Framework, working through other forums like G7, OECD, or potentially even this sort of new concept of a D10 grouping of democracies. And I think the third thing is, you know, Canada can play a role in sort of helping Taiwan recapture its narrative. I mean, China has tried to focus on shaping the international community's understanding of Taiwan, and Canada can sort of, through its one China policy, can help clarify that, you know, it has legitimate relations with both Taipei and Beijing, and, you know, push back on China's imposition of the one China principle. Okay, Russell?
Thanks, and let me just close off by, you know, sort of returning back to the point that you made very early in the beginning about 2758, UN Resolution 2758, and I think that's really the heart of the discussion. We talk very broadly about international space, but the United Nations is the focus of our discussion. And, you know, and I would point to your viewers to watch GTI's annual symposium last week, where we featured the 25th National Security Advisor and the chairman of GTI's U.S.-Taiwan Task Force, Ambassador Robert O'Brien, who's an international lawyer as well. We spoke clearly on this matter of what the UN 2758 is dispositive of. It's not dispositive of whether or not Taiwan can meaningfully participate in international organizations or within the UN system. It was very technical. It was a resolution with regards to, as you had clearly stated in the textual reading of the resolution, with regards to China's seat in the UN Security Council. And that should not be used as a legal bar for Taiwan's ability to meaningfully participate in the UN system. And furthermore, I think the final point I would add is just reemphasize the importance of supporting Taiwan's international space as a means to deter China from taking military action against Taiwan. And I think that, you know, as we are able to bring in more support for Taiwan's international space, that would raise the risks and stakes for China to engage in what we all, I believe, hope would never come about, which is a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Russell, for summing that up so well. I think that the next step as we move forward is to think more carefully about how Canada can play a constructive role in that. And I'm sure that we will be able to get to that in further MLI events and publications. So I want to thank the MLI for supporting us on this. And I want to thank everybody for being here, including the ambassador from TICO. And I would like to thank everybody for watching this event today. And thank you very much. 多谢，谢谢。